Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar is all about creating a competitive advantage with modern management. So just to kind of set the scene, just to kind of, sort of introduce ourselves, if you may have heard of us or sort of spoke to us in the past. Today's webinar has been sort of hugely inspired by obviously the sort of current events and so on. And with some interesting information to boot. So today's going to be discussing about some of the modern management benefits, approaches, and so on from a PowerON perspective, and some thoughts and considerations around that. In terms of some of the information for obviously supporting today's webinar, and kind of the reason why it's been sort of inspired is around 40% of organizations recently, will sort of by 2023 anyway, are looking to sort of start to introduce anywhere operations. This idea of being able to work from anywhere, being able to sort of manage anyone from anywhere, and so on, right? And that's sort of seeing a sort of big transformation project happening in quite a lot of organizations, right? It's becoming more and more a sort of strategic weapon, right? So at the moment, sort of flexibility and sort of resource management, sort of internal capabilities of organizations differ wildly. So off the back of that, with obviously lots and lots of conversations with clients these days, we've been inspired to sort of put this together, to sort of start helping paint that picture and sort of discuss some of the sort of constraints that we're seeing, and obviously how, with some of the flexibility and modern management capabilities from a PowerON perspective, leveraging your existing stuff from Microsoft, what you could expect to see change and so on as well, right? So today's webinar is going to be about 30 minutes long. We'll do our best to sort of keep things quite precise and concise where it matters, and do our best obviously towards the tail end to sort of, tie everything up, and sort of help, potentially answer any questions or anything we need to support on that. So we'll get to that in a moment. So my name is Heinrich Pelser. I'm head of the pre-sales team here at PowerON. So my responsibility and role is I pretty much talk for a living, trying to understand clients' needs, sort of to put the relevant bits and pieces in place to obviously help drive those conversations forward, right? And with obviously the current situation, as you guys would expect, lots and lots have been focused around modern management with people working from home and so on as well. Also subsequently joined by our CTO, Mr. Steve Beaumont, who's got a long, illustrious career behind him, and will be part of today's discussion, talking about some of the benefits and some of the advantages as well that you could expect in terms of a modern management setup and approach. So to kind of help paint today's picture, I would like to introduce ourselves. We're PowerON Platforms. We specialize across sort of three main assets relevant to sort of the desktop space, right? And those things sort of include some managed services, we'll touch on towards the tail end. We have an integration-based service that obviously help organizations manage, deploy, and maintain standards across their desktop environment, sort of alleviating some of the pressures and pains from an everyday perspective. We help businesses do that quite a lot. We also provide professional services. So we've got some really good consultancy support guys to kind of help put in place some of these bits and pieces from a consultative engagement. And toward the tail end, everything is supplemented with a really robust sort of support services arm to the organization to not just help within the ad hoc day-to-day support of desktop and management requirements, but also start to bolster and support our managed services, obviously as individuals adopt them as well, right? In terms of some of the sort of stats, we're a sort of growing organization at the moment, sort of 50 plus, if you look to include the sort of associate pool of resources that we have, including the sort of full-time staff here. And at the moment, we're managing over 20,000 devices sort of spread across the planet at the moment as well, right? We're a UK-based organization with a headquarters in York, but in terms of the management and the clients and stuff we support, very much operate across a global reach, right? And here's some of the organizations we've worked with recently as well. And on top of that, PowerON Platforms prides itself in its EM&S Elite Partnership Program. It gives us really good, insightful inroads into what's up and coming, and also working quite closely with the people at Microsoft, right? To sort of start help better understanding where they're going. So obviously we can then subsequently go ahead and support organizations. We're also sort of hold gold competencies across the data center side of things, cloud platform, and then Windows device as well. We're also ISO accredited. In terms of today's agenda, what we're going to be talking about, I wanted to make sure we cover off some of the current challenges that IT are facing at the moment, right? And these aren't the sort of mundane things you might expect. This has very much been taken from a user's perspective, trying to understand, okay, What are users facing? How's that impacting IT? And then what's IT's journey in order to start mitigating some of those bits and pieces, right? Why you should start to think and care about things like modern management within your organization today, and obviously off the back of that, you know, how PowerON can support that journey, right? And then towards the tail end, we'll be discussing some of the smart teaming desktop aspects, which forms part of our sort of portfolio of managed services, on, you know, a potential approach that organizations could look to take to obviously kind of drive things forward, right? So in order to sort of start painting that picture, we need to start understanding what are some of the changes that we're facing, right? So in terms of an IT department or sort of business heads these days, the obvious is already there on the screen, right? So working outside of the office. Now, this in itself introduces some really kind of potent things and thoughts and considerations for IT organizations, right? So with everyone being asked to work from home, pressures and pains in terms of access to resources from a work day-to-day perspective is massively fluctuating, right? So individuals these days have requirements for childcare, which was previously something they mitigated in other means. So the pandemic has obviously had a massive influence on that. Home and work-life pressures, it feels like you're sort of never leaving the office as well, right? And that in itself can have some, you know, considerations for IT. And on top of that as well, IT are now sometimes being asked to manage things they're not previously potentially used to managing. Well, not at this scale anyway, right? So what are the sort of thought process and stuff that IT are going through there? So the end users at the moment, right, to adapt to potentially a very quick, short burst of work that they haven't been able to do prior to that through the internet and so on as well, right? We're also seeing this shift at the moment, which is really, really interesting, especially with some clients in London, ironically as well, right? So the idea of that, this death of the HQ, in terms of what businesses initially thought would happen was productivity would potentially plummet or definitely go down. That's sometimes mitigated by sort of current solutions that organizations might already put in, right? So if you have a way in, a means of your end users accessing stuff internally, that's fine. But the idea was that potentially, you know, there would be this relevant lockdown period, and that's been staggered as well. And now sort of that potential phasing and bringing people back into work might be something that businesses are rethinking. So one of the things around that is, you know, you've got organizations in expensive areas of the country like London and Scotland and Wales and so on, who are potentially looking to downsize that office because, you know what, we figured out that actually people are working better remotely. Productivity is up. People are far happier to do that, as a matter of fact. And, you know, let's look to decrease that footprint. So in terms of a business positive side of things, that's a net gain in terms of not paying rent or whatever the case might be. So then when you do start to bring people into the office or changing the way in which they work, businesses are starting to think about that differently, right? So a natural evolution of the services an IT department provides obviously has to fall in line with that potential change in business vision or business objective. So we are seeing this ever decreasing requirement at the moment for offices, and businesses are starting to do their best to bolster themselves in preparation for obviously going towards something like a HQ-less type approach, right? In conjunction with that, we're seeing a higher reliance at the moment on software as a service based tools for obvious reasons. So sort of one-stop shop, M365, Office 365, we're seeing that being heavily utilized at the moment as well, which in its own right introduces some challenges for IT as well, right? And we'll get to that in a moment. So in terms of that, you know, being able to provide services beyond the perimeter network is a big challenge. It also introduces another challenge to organizations in terms of things like access. If you couple that with the death of the HQ type of conversation, is that businesses are hiring very differently. So for example, at the moment, what working from home has forced organizations to do, or maybe change the way they're thinking, is you're no longer massively interested in hiring someone with the relevant talent or skills for any job within your business within a 30-mile radius anymore. Talent, people, and so on can now be global. All right, so this is something we're seeing that it's been massively adopted as well. And then the enablement of SaaS platforms or internet-based platforms is massively attractive for businesses to start leveraging that as well, right? So we are seeing this change and this shift in how organizations are starting to structure internal projects and workloads, obviously to meet the end users' needs as well, right? And on top of that, the other thing that's quite interesting as well is there's physical work behavioral changes within people, right? So individuals that have to structure their days differently from, okay, I need to commute into the city, for example, or commute to an office, are now having to restructure their days, which introduces some really challenging things for IT to think about. So people on output-based work as opposed to time-based work are structuring their days differently. So they might start at 11 o'clock in the morning and work till 7 or 8 at night, or they might start in the evenings, ironically, and work till midnight, for example. So that change in user behavior, although it doesn't massively affect the services you provide, it does definitely affect how IT interacts with that individual, right? And to be able to supply them with stuff, making sure they're compliant and accessing a lot of their resources. So the basic point there is that end users are massively shifting the sort of goalposts at the moment in terms of what IT used to do traditionally. Right now, a lot of this is being, I suppose, mitigated and enforced by the initial need to obviously work from home, no longer sort of to have a constant or more constant access to a HQ, a higher resilience on internet-based tools, and obviously then being able to, well, pretty much having their hand forced, and obviously then being able to move into managing their lifestyles around work at the moment as well, right, because of the current circumstances. So let's look at, some of the hurdles that gives IT, right? So, I mean, to be honest with you, at a fundamental level, lots of the businesses that we're talking to at the moment, right, if you don't have a solution, a capability, or a remit to provide accessible services out to your business users in terms of the end users that you need to support, organizations are going to struggle, right? So productivity definitely goes down. It introduces lots of risks as part of that as well, whether that be timelines, client commitments, and so on as well, right? One of the biggest things that we're sort of seeing at the moment is an impact in terms of business productivity. So where certain services are up, it changes the terms of what IT needs to give them, but it can also enforce IT to provide business productivity services which they didn't cater for previously. So basic things in terms of application access, access to internal software and services, file share access, all of those things at the moment are a hurdle for IT that they need to overcome, right? So sometimes they can feel a little bit left in the dark, and then what's the right answer to start solving that problem? Is it money? Is it more staff? Is it a SaaS solution? Is it modern management? Kind of what are the things to think about? Obviously, when you have to start to look to provide things like business continuity as well, right? And business productivity. Because the other thing as well that we're seeing with that is this high reliance on something anecdotal like video, right? So businesses are having to provide a video capability to their end users to feel more engaged, and obviously video conferencing is something that's massively important. Some organizations adopted that at a high level, some did, some didn't. And then off the back of that, now you have to start thinking about different things, device performance, cameras, and so on and so on. Again, something, IT, potentially usually didn't think about at that point in time as well, right? Security compliance in its own right can be a big challenge. So if you are enabling access to apps and services from other devices, staying in control of that a lot of the time, especially if you're doing that with people already outside of the boundary of your network, is in itself something to consider for IT, because the perimeter, so to speak, has changed. Obviously, the usual perimeter was you'd have an office, you'd have firewalls, and then within that you control everything. Now the perimeter is the end user's device, it's the software, it's the email, right? So that particular security boundary has obviously massively shifted as well, right? And obviously in conjunction with that, operational overheads, we talked earlier about, that move away from, no more HQ potentially, or no more offices, and being more and more sort of remote based, providing services outside of things like traditional VPNs and RDS services, has its own limitations and constraints, right? So you're still having to pump things in. What's the mitigation measures? Are you ready to scale for that as well, right? So again, a big hurdle for IT to overcome if you're looking at just providing, sort of immediate access as part of that. IT departments are also being forced to change the way in which they work because of a couple of things. First one is things like the introduction of modern OSs. So you've got Windows 10, that requires a process-based approach, which we'll get to in a moment as well. That change in user behavior as to when that end user is online and working also means IT has an interesting problem, because how do you then provide a maintenance window for that person or that group or that team who are now working outside of the boundaries of the norm, so to speak, right, without impacting them too much as well, right? And then on top of that as well, looking at things like, IT's reach. IT's reach at the moment is something that they're massively trying to extend, right? Now, with a lot of that, sometimes expanding your existing portfolio of capabilities means you start more and more and more projects at a perpetual rate. So IT needs to extend its reach to a VPN type technology to get people access into an intranet site. that can be quite time consuming. And then what's the impact of that to the organization from a delivery perspective, from a functionality perspective, and from a productivity obviously perspective, right? So in essence, IT then starts to focus on more value add, high critical based projects and things such as the everyday things like patching, supplying applications, Windows 10 provisioning, all those type of things tend to slip. And then IT at the moment are sort of facing this ever-changing window, a sliding window in terms of being able to provide those services, right? And being able to build and bolster them. So an ever-growing rate of new projects is something that's being massively felt by IT at the moment as well, right? And then the biggest thing as well is to look at a procedural approach. This is a big hurdle for IT. When you're reacting, it's then very difficult at times to switch immediately to then now go through a procedural based approach, right? However, in order for sort of long-term success in terms of the modern management side of things, right, it is very, very important. So then organizations do start to shift their focus to adopting modern management, okay? And all of those elements in terms of hurdles for IT, what that boils down to in terms of adopting modern management comes down to three main facets that they have to provide the organization with, right? So the big driver for all of this is around things like basic productivity. End users and businesses need to be able to provide access to staff around the world, vendors, clients, their own people, access to software and services in order for them to be productive as well, right? In conjunction with that, making sure that you have the relevant security controls in place around data management, around email management, around device management. If you've got security compliance that you need to adhere to, for argument's sake, Cyber Essentials Plus requires you to patch within a 14-day window. Do you have those mechanisms in place to, number one, action those requirements, and then obviously number two, as part of that, report back on those requirements that they've been met. And as I said before, that perimeter around the data and the sort of device is something that IT might be dealing with for the first time these days, as opposed to having that perimeter-based offense as well, right? And then obviously the big thing is that with the current pandemic, it has massively forced the hands of many businesses. So in terms of the mindset of businesses, it's massively shifted. Let's look at doing things differently now. Let's look at obviously providing services out and about, and let's start to drive that modern management way of working, which in itself, by proxy, then will force IT to behave, act, and deliver things differently, right? And then increase the pressures that they face as they're driving forwards as well, right? I'm going to hand over to Mr. Steve Beaumont now to drill down in what's included, right? So Steve's going to talk about some of the modern management benefits, and obviously, why some of the people involved in IT departments haven't maybe joined the party. And then off the back of that, we'll talk about back to the approach. So thanks for listening, and over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Heinrich. Good morning, everybody. So, modern management is unfortunately not just a single product that you go and buy. So there's no silver bullet here where I say, go and implement this tool set and it solves all of your woes. As you've heard Heinrich go through various different aspects and very specifically about this mindset change that's happening. It's kind of been enforced on us a lot quicker, but it was coming anyway. And it drills down to these different areas that you can see on screen and how we start to look at how we approach and adapt and give yourself that business competitive edge to be able to be further ahead in this arc that's we're now on, to be able to deliver services both to your internal end users and to your external customers in a much more efficient and conjoined way. So this anytime access and anywhere access is probably the thing that's most on people's mind at the minute, where we're having this big shift of people having to leave the offices, work from home, or work from anywhere. But with, as Heinrich said, that change in working styles, in patterns, where people don't have to do this commute anymore. They're structuring the work around when they've got homeschooling activities. They're finding they can now go for breaks at lunchtime in a lot different manner. For example, the other day I went for a walk. Yeah, I was still communicating with my team on things like Teams on my mobile, reacting to messages that are coming through on my smartwatch, etc. But how we control the access to them systems and not have to be beholden to opening office hours and when them systems are available is absolutely key. But making sure that we do it securely, making sure that productivity and collaboration on the different document sets that we have from the correct places and from the correct people becomes very important to understand. We're not looking to try and say, well, actually, we have to rely on somebody VPNing in or being sat in a specific office that has access to these systems anymore. So looking at different control mechanisms, things that allow us access outside of technologies like VPNs, looking at different products like remote proxying technologies for websites, looking at collaboration tools like Office 365, but putting the security and the management aspects around there to say, actually, we define what is allowed to access, whether it is a managed device, a secured device, so checking that it has things like updates, that it meets our requirements with our security policies, that it's from the right location. So being able to say, well, fine, most of our staff are based in these geographic locations, or we have multi-factor authentication controls in place that says we have a wider scope of devices that can access them, but we are doing our checks that require they are securely accessing them, is part of that modern management overhaul. It's not just purely about being able to do like we traditionally did, where we have a defined standard image, and that is the only thing that you can use, but going to that dreaded scenario of bring your own devices, how we look at how we securely access and control them becomes a new facet that we have to understand in the ways that we approach the modern management access side. And that also then starts to pivot to things like the support aspects, especially with people now working from home, etc. You're not going to rely on somebody going and doing a desk side visit. So how we can structure these devices and how they are provisioned and maintained so we can get users back up and running should things go wrong, or securely and remotely access them, while still making sure that we can still control them devices in terms of what we want our standards and our configurations, again, is very important. Having that reliance yet again on things like connecting to a physical network for group policy controls, having devices VPN to be able to get updates, while it should work, experience shows that it doesn't work, or it works in a limited fashion. We've had experiences of large organizations of things like 40-odd thousand devices where maybe only 50% of them devices would actually be working on VPN. Users might just turn the device on, check a quick website, turn them off again, and then therefore they don't have the time or they don't connect to main core network, so they don't get the controls, the security updates, the patches, all things that are key and critical to make sure that in a very widespread disconnected environment that we still have them controls. So looking at that decoupling away from them internal reliances, how we can still reach out and remotely support them devices obviously becomes very key and critical to a wider accessed workforce. But those controls and the mechanisms, so both from the terms of what controls we put on the device through policies, how we make sure that they securely access and where they can access from, must not impede performance, because this is that big driver. And it was that worry about devices and users working outside of the office is making sure that productivity is not impacted. There's nothing worse than it taking another 20 minutes for a device to start up before you can actually do something, being able to get to a productive desktop. So being able to make sure that both the controls and the layers that we put around it and the hoops that you have to jump through to access all of your collaboration materials and what you're working on should not impede productivity. So looking at things as much as possible around that whole approach of single sign-ons, making sure that you don't have to jump through and manually establish connections back into the internal infrastructure if you still require to come in, making sure it just flows through with various technologies such as things like the remote app proxying, have to be key and important to your approach to modern management. End users just want to work. They want to get on in a seamless fashion. So making sure it's structured so it just flows for them without being too technical, and things are not designed to be slowed down by adding on multiple layers is a key consideration to the modern management. And that also then leads into the whole fact that it's got to be cost effective. A lot of the stuff that may already be invested in is not about just chucking everything out, so chucking the baby out with the bathwater. It's making sure that we leverage what you have access to, what you have access to but may not be using, what is built into the systems that you have. So things like the technology is built and baked into the Microsoft Windows products, the Office 365 or the M365 stack, and where they might represent a chance to both get a return on your investment and also save costs across the board on similar products that you already have or would be looking to utilize to enable some of these scenarios. So if we move on to looking at what some of these benefits can bring in implementing some of these. So we talk about that whole idea of anytime access anywhere. And that also brings in some resiliency gains as you start to adopt that approach of decoupling from your on-premise infrastructure, reliance on you yourself having to provide high availability around things like Active Directory, your file servers, so on, which is costly. Everyone tends to run multiple data centers or at least backup systems within there in case things go wrong, making sure that the application layers are structured, doubling up your server costs, and the things that go behind that in terms of, and this kind of leads on to that reducing complexity bullet point above, the effort that goes into and the cost of providing them on premises can quite easily be offset of both moving to more of a SaaS-based solution, which will then offer that high availability aspect, and quite often at a much higher level than what can be done internally. The skill sets might be there to do it internally, but the overhead that it provides, the time you spend keeping the lights on, sometimes don't outweigh the benefits or the cost of moving to a much more SaaS-based focused solution, which then opens up all the different avenues that we've kind of touched on in about enabling staff to access these from anywhere securely with the controls that are put around it, because they are designed as a SaaS-based solution to be securely accessed from anywhere without the limits of you having to be inside of your environment. And one of the key tendencies around that is, as Heinrich mentioned, is moving that security boundary from that typical approach of inside your network with an edge firewall that's blocking all the bad guys coming in, to looking at actually now the user identity being that security boundary. So freeing yourself up to be able to use any device at any time, controlling it across multiple different things, but looking at what the user specifically is doing, how they authenticate, are they who they say they are, risk-based access controls, and allowing them to actually use the most suitable devices that they want to use at the right time to access the things that you need them to get on and do. And both the user side and then things like that risk-based sign-on leads on to the telemetry and the analytics, which is absolutely key and important to both delivering this, but also as giving back a benefit for you to structure how you approach this. I'm a big fan of saying that data is king, being able to understand what is going on within your environment, to be able to analyze that, spot trends, and look at specifically where to target your approach and your focus makes a big difference than spinning up multiple projects, doing stuff, hoping that it's going to be a benefit or thinking it is, and then missing what is actually key to it. So with a lot of the modern management stack is we have access to a wealth of information. And a lot of this is just freely going up into Microsoft at the minute, but gaining access to it, which Microsoft freely provide back, and as part of the modern management solutions, looking at things like endpoint analytics, user analytics, being able to see what devices are impacted, what's performing best within your environment, how long does it take to get to that productive desktop, gives you much better insight into where to target your efforts to look at saying, well, actually, fine, we thought them 4-year-old devices were okay for our end users. Actually, it's showing that this 6-year-old device is actually better, or this newer device, because we've got these technologies, the SSDs, are absolutely giving some benefit back to the business, because users can get on and use them within 20 seconds rather than waiting for the 15 minutes while they make the coffees and so on. I mentioned about that reducing complexity, making sure that we're no longer looking at having to maintain some of these legacy, traditional on-premise infrastructures. So if you think about how much effort usually goes into maintaining your management tool sets, just at the simple layer of things like the SQL databases in the back end, how you have to make sure the VMs are running, they're patched. So we've seen customers that have had global distribution points with things like LANDesk and Config Manager right across the globe, where being able to strip out some of that complexity and looking at the modern technologies with things like peer-to-peer technologies or cloud-based SaaS solutions greatly increase their focus and their time to actually look at providing transformational projects back to the business rather than worrying whether the SQL database is up and running. And it's that IT transformation that's the biggest benefit that you get in that longer term approach to this, because obviously you need to look at implementing some of this in the first standpoint. But when you have started the journey, you're getting the first phases in and you're getting your telemetry back, you're seeing what's actually impacting users, and you're not maintaining them legacy systems and just focusing on the day-to-day keeping the lights on, you can actually shift your teams to looking at actually, now where do we go now? Can we actually look at having a better collaboration system? What do we do around things like the file and print scenarios? How do we actually revolutionize how we take contact information in on our CRM systems? How do we expedite that information out? How do we do big data projects? And look at the stuff that actually matters to the business rather than just what matters for IT in terms of the running of the IT systems. Now, why hasn't everyone already jumped to this stage? It's a combination of different things, and it's not unusual for people to say, well, we're busy. And especially in this current scenario, work a lot with NHS. There's some customers within NHS that had already started down this journey and they had to accelerate it to be able to meet the demand of people working from home. But there's others that hadn't started down that journey yet, and their core business is looking after sick patients, which in this time period is absolutely what they're focused on. So yes, they are too busy to it, but they do still need, and it's very conscious that they need to come back and look at what needs to be done, because as a sustainable aspect, we're not probably likely to go back to how we was before in its truest sense ever again. Remote working, people accessing everywhere, getting used to the idea or liking the fact that they can work flexible hours and stuff is here to stay. So being able to now look at that, look at the business requirements for it is key and important, and it needs to happen. But that whole idea of when it first started, yes, we're too busy, there's no need to move yet, is going to go, but that's what one of the blockers was for people adopting this previously, which is now kind of being pushed aside because people need to move to it. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes money. There's no denying that. It's not a free switch that you just flick overnight and you just move to it. A lot of organizations will find they already have access to a lot of the tool sets they need, especially within the M365 stack. And again, that might offset the cost aspect. And then it's the cost to do the project and do the implementation side of it, if yourselves or with assistance. But it's also an art form, because it's not just the one-time exercise to just move to a new tool set. This is a complete mind shift change. The whole aspect behind the Windows 10 modern management is it's ever evolving. And this is the biggest difference from the traditional side to the modern management side, is it is not a standstill. We've reached a goal and now we're done. New features are coming through all of the time, and how you make sure that as part of this mind shift change, you adopt that very quick and agile, updating, ever marching forwards, looking at the new solutions that are coming out, looking at the new improvements and new features and adopting them as they come in or as they make sense, is an art form to understand how to make sure this is always improving. And I've got a VPN. I mentioned it numerous times. It's not to pick on VPNs. VPNs can be very, very good if they are done right. But having a VPN in effect so that remote users can get access to your systems is not modern management. That is a remote access management solution. Some better, some not so good. Always on should be a minimum these days. Again, going back to that whole idea of being able to access it seamlessly without having to go through multiple different hoops. But removing the need for a VPN is that first step towards getting to a much more modern management solution as you access applications and systems in a much more different manner, rather than just saying it's an extension of your data center, not having to rely on that VPN being up to manage the devices in the first place, so direct over the cloud management. So I've got VPN is one that we hear all the times. I'm just making it very clear, it is not modern management, it is remote access, which is one component of the modern management stack. And the infrastructure, to come back to it again, it's not just about stripping it out. You're not going to remove your entire data center overnight. A lot of your legacy line of business applications, or not legacy, even traditional ones that are currently in use and active, might not be geared up for this. They may require remote access solutions, whether that be something like a VPN, or you look at different scenarios such as Windows Virtual Desktop or remote access and publishing of them applications is a different way to think of it. But certainly looking at what infrastructure on premises is actually needed. And I say on premises could be a physical data center down in Slough, or it could be a virtual machine up in the cloud. That's still what I class as on premises, so that traditional style infrastructure. But making sure you do that assessment and look at actually where the key components that are absolutely needed, and then stripping out the stuff around it, things like file servers, they are a key thing that can be looked, and they are probably one of them blocking points for organizations where people have to come in for that old style file access. Looking at how you deliver them services in much more of a modern way, securely accessing from anywhere, anytime, security based on the user identity, are the things that you start to look at to see how we can shift them out. But they are not acceptable as a blocker to say, well, we can't do all that lot because we have to come in via this way. There is different ways to approach accessing them still required stuff internally. With that, I'm going to hand back to Heinrich, which will show you some of the approaches around what I've just talked around, how we specifically start to look at tackling some of these objections, challenges, or ways to get across and into modern management.
It's beautiful. Thanks for that, Steve. I mean, I think to sort of, I suppose, sort of next logical question in a lot of people's minds is, okay, well, how do we start that journey, right? And what's the sort of path that we need to think about, right? And this is something that we've been sort of developing very heavily in terms of real world scenarios with organizations who are feeling all of the pressures and pains, you know, sort of aforementioned. And in conjunction with that as well, I'll try and be as direct as possible while still maintaining a level of terseness as well, is in terms of the usual start points or the sort of recommended starting points, it's around the strategic help, right? So in terms of our approach to how we've all helped organizations get towards this modern management endpoint, right, is around the strategic help side of things, right? So this is the time we take with businesses to think creatively about their teams, about their technology, and about their approaches to things, right? Basic things are, as Steve mentioned just a moment ago, right, around things like challenging the status quo, right? Sort of questioning a lot of the assumptions that are obviously part of that in order to then help define a vision and a roadmap into sort of meeting some of those business criteria elements we discussed higher up as well, right? So that strategic help part in itself is a sort of very important facet in how to sort of being able to drive the future phases of that. There's the natural elements as well around things like the build and progress work in terms of standing up infrastructure and recommended services and frameworks in which to operate in to achieve these modern management goals and recommendations and standards and all the things that make up that particular framework. Is obviously something that we've spent a lot of time building, developing, and helping organizations progress with, right? In conjunction with that, we mentioned at the top of the call around the support services. So it's not a set and forget, we are there every step of the way. And that in itself is kind of very much manifested and driven by a managed services offering, which is in its own right an integration service into your business to start meeting and maintaining some of those modern management aspects we discussed earlier as well, right? So in response to that, PowerON's obviously developed its own range of smart desktop solutions, right? So in this particular instance, right, one of the key factors 4 of them, as a matter of fact, right, to sort of drive towards modern management. Some very important and careful considerations have been made by the business, right, over time to start looking at, okay, how does PowerON platforms help support businesses into this modern management landscape, right? What does it truly mean? So one of the biggest things we needed to sort of compensate and work with is to leverage your existing device and licensing investments already, right? And that in itself is to drive 4 key areas, right? So in terms of the initial one there around better employee engagement, it's the ability to use modern management capabilities around things like autopilot, right? Being able to patch and upgrade through the internet in a very phased and logical manner, being able to proactively monitor that end user's performance, right? Endpoint analytics and all those types of things are becoming more and more prevalent these days when device performance is a big thing these days, right? In terms of, we talked about earlier, video call, higher processing power sometimes might be required. Being able to manage that end user performance means we keep the end users happy, being able to make decisions based on data in terms of new hardware or software or services and so on that the organization needs to provide as well, right? Coupled with that, security is built into the core offering, right? So we know that, for example, security is a big thing. We talked about that new perimeter, right? The corporate network was the safety net, but now things are massively changing, right? What licensing provisions can you help with in terms of obviously meeting that, securing files and access to data, as well as then the device itself through some of the enterprise capabilities available within Windows 10 are all things we help turn on and manage as part of that, right? We talked about some of the operational procedural aspects higher up in that as well, right? So the operational excellence in terms of that is through tried and tested methods with a wide range of businesses, both public and private. What's the best way of actually going through this particular sort of measure, right? What does it take to use and run modern management as well, right? So procedures and working practices are carefully created around your business, right, to use these modern tools to make sure that we are driving towards those goals in a phased, logical, proven manner as well, right? And obviously then, more importantly, towards the end there is to start to think about how we start making decisions. So empowering business-led IT is a culmination of the previous 3 aspects, with also then supporting businesses and business leaders in making decisions based on data, right? So on top of that, what are some of the business benefits, we sort of start to see realized as part of this particular approach, right? So in terms of obviously making sure that clients get maximum value in terms of the organizational remits that they need to operate in, we need to make sure we take careful care of some very sort of potential outcomes that organizations are wanting. Businesses want to reduce the amount of effort and time spent, right? They want to look at boosting things like productivity. We need to make sure that devices are secure. We want to make things simpler, not necessarily easy. Easy is I suppose, the sort of assumption that things take little to no effort. And then off the back of that, also make sure that we're future-proof, right? So going towards this cloud-based approach of management is going to be a key facet to that, right? So some of the immediate benefits realized is around getting devices to end users really fast. We talked about Intune and autopilot and all that type of stuff in previous webinars we've sort of done, but all of those things fall in line with being able to very quickly get users working or new users onboarded and working, right? Access and empowering staff is a big thing we've seen as well, right? End users don't necessarily want to sit on a call to IT to get access to either email or services or whatever the case might be, boosting that productivity to have applications and services like self-service password reset, multi-factor, all those things at a self-service sort of side of things for users is a big step in taking the relevant productivity measures you need to give to them as well, right? Keeping devices secure. We've done some really good work on the Cyber Essentials Plus things as well, actually, if you guys are interested in that, please get in touch with us to talk about that. But on top of that, keeping devices secure from the get-go, right, is obviously something that we sort of massively pride ourselves on. And that includes and can be extended to things such as data and so on. As we talked about the operational overheads with a simplified topology that makes all part of that particular service and the subsets and the components that form as part of that, with the operational procedures, with the sort of simplified topology around the cloud management side of things, all of those things goes a long way to making IT's life far simpler. And on top of that, being in a cloud ready environment, it means you can scale at will. All right, organizations can look to onboard, deliver and provide these services with PowerON's backing, obviously off the bat as well, right? So you are then starting to meet these business goals. So if we look at some of the technology areas that are realized, we haven't massively touched on these yet. Looking at things like the cloud management of Windows 10 is very quickly realized with, for example, the smart desktop services as well, right? On top of that, managing Windows updates, very, very key component as part of that, right? So these are some of the functional capabilities realized very, very quickly, leveraging this framework and this particular service in conjunction with that. Third-party update management is a key asset as well that organizations are starting to leverage more and more, with things like additional services and software now being available to businesses in that perimeter network as well, right? More importantly, one of the biggest things we see organizations potentially fall over on and presents a real big problem is Windows as a service management. Taking that away from the teams and letting PowerON manage that in itself is a massive benefit in just being able to free up resources and making all of those decisions based on data with that integration service into the team is something that we're seeing optimized for Windows 10 as well, right? So as part of that, a lot of the analytics and the sort of desktop and endpoint analytics starts to help businesses understand the optimized provisioning of Windows 10 is something that's becoming more and more and more important. We talked about things like autopilot, understanding the working behavior of people will also then help to start and structure how organizations go forward. In conjunction with that, we've already touched on things like the security control and configurations as part of that. We've done some very, very extensive work with the guys at NCSE as well in developing some of those standards and being able to put them in play for businesses around the Intune front and the Windows 10 front as well to make sure that organizations are adopting those security standards and recommendations off the get-go. And at the big thing as well, right, being able to control and configure those off the bat as well, right? And then being able to have visibility of that. One of the biggest things we're talking about organizations these days about is things like reporting. Who needs to see what information? Why does it matter? And then how is that information measured, right? Getting an active line of sight of your infrastructure from a desktop management perspective is critical. All of those things comprised, you know, is effectively the roadmap and the way in which you then start to expand your modern management capabilities and then really start to drive the organization forward, right? So in terms of that competitive edge, what does it provide organizations, right? We talked about things like better productivity, right? Ensuring that the solutions and the people are productive in itself is a massive value add for organizations these days. Making sure you're not stopping and starting in any particular engagements or line of business type work you're carrying on with is going to be critical. And at the same time, providing that end user the flexibility to meet organizational needs, fitting into their lifestyles in itself is going to be quite important as well, right? Looking at things like data analytics, simplifying the decision-making process internally to start either adopting, adapting, or altering services to meet organizational needs is going to be a key thing. You're no longer waiting for things to happen to you. You're stacking the odds into your favor by ultimately being able to predict future outcome based on the information you're seeing as well, right? Empowering people. So we've talked about this already. So it's not just around productivity. It's also about making sure that anything that end user needs to provide or cater for themselves is available to them. Software delegation, making sure they have access to the relevant application sets. It can even go as far down as being able to sort of elevate their permissions for any given reasons while still being heavily tracked and audited by IT as well, right? All of those things means a reduced number of calls to the help desk. The end user is far more self-sufficient and can obviously crack on and do what they need to do as well in terms of their work, right? The beauty of all of this as well is that with a modern management framework and a modern management adaptation to the business, it also means that, you know, you can start to scale and deliver operations from pretty much anywhere with an internet connection. I know that's something that lots of organizations strive for, but in terms of leveraging that smart desktop capability sets we mentioned earlier, modern management stops being a goal and becomes a standard. So it's a case of starting to adopt that going forwards. And because lots of organizations tend to chase this at times as well, right? You find yourself always treading water potentially as well. And then obviously towards the tail end is to be far more strategic, taking careful considerations and planning to start driving the modern management things forward, delivers all of the previous aforementioned capability sets that does give organizations that competitive edge in not having to deal with the mundane, not having to deal with the heavy process-driven side of things, being able to park that off, realize the functional capabilities of modern management, you know, and overall start delivering business objectives as well, right? I think all in all, we've done our best today to obviously explain some of the challenges, the benefits, the approach, and then ultimately, you know, sort of towards the tail end of today, what modern management is designed to provide organizations. As I said, PowerON Platform have done an extensive line of work to make this as simple as possible to adopt through very careful planning, very strategic based workshops and elements to obviously support business with their unique needs. Modern management by no means is a sort of one size fits all type approach. And as I said off the back of that, PowerON's also developed a wide range of services and offerings to start helping with that, right? And those things include, as I said earlier, technical support as part of that, the managed services, that integration service we talked about, consultancy effort, as well as that, you have access to myself and Steve if you have any questions or any way we can obviously help the business. I think we're a little bit over time, but thank you very much for obviously sort of attending today's webinar. There's some information on screen there, so if you have any questions, please pass them over to the team at info@poweronplatforms.com. If you have an account manager, please get in touch with him or her. More than happy to sort of have any follow-up opportunities, and all of the information is obviously available on our website as well. Feel free to reach out to me, myself and Steve as well. We're always happy to help and support you guys going forwards. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.